Hi, everybody. Welcome to 18-Minute Leaders. I'm your host, Karina Rock, JI's West Coast Director. I'm so honored to have Rabbi Akiva Gersh here as our guest. Akiva, welcome.
Thank you for the invite.
Oh, we're so honored to have you. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Briefly, I'll share that I'm originally from America, from New York. I made Aliyah. I moved to Israel in 2004 with my wife, Tamar. And I've been working in the field of Jewish and Israel education now for about 20 years, a little over actually. And for the past 15 years or so, I've been leading groups around Israel, teaching them about Jewish history, Israeli history, and taking them to historical, cultural, and natural sites all over the country. This past year with COVID-19, everything kind of shifted, and I brought my own personal Israeli education work online. And I created something called At Israel, which is kind of a collection, a library of different offerings related to Israel education, from virtual tours to classes. And I've been loving it, and just love that I have the opportunity to continue to share about Israel. I love to write as well. I'll just really briefly share that I've been writing a blog on the Times of Israel for many, many years. A lot of what I've been writing has to do with this experience of living in Israel, moving one's life to Israel, making Aliyah, the journey of acclimating to life in Israel. And I put a book out a few years ago. I'll just use a little prop over here called Becoming Israeli. And I kind of I like to say I became positively obsessed, meaning obsessed in a positive way, just about what's happening in Israel. Like there's something happening here, and this process of becoming Israeli. So a few years ago, I published a book all about that.
Awesome. And I know we'll hear a little bit about, what's in that book and later in our discussion. So today's topic, really, we're focusing in on how to strengthen our connection to Israel, and also some tools on how to bring Israel into our lives and in our homes. So my first question for you is that it's about something that you taught me in our discussions earlier, that there's this idiom called Rosh Gado in Israel, and that you don't want to be a Rosh Katan, but you want to be a Rosh Gadol. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means?
For sure. It's one of my favorite sayings here in Israel. And the more I live here, the more I see this as one of the fundamental foundations of life in Israel. Being a Rosh Gadol, first of all, Rosh Gadol literally means big head, but that's not what it means. It means to be someone who is a forward thinker, a person who takes initiative, someone who gets up and gets things done. Someone who doesn't just sit around and waits for somebody else to do it, or even just sits around and waits for somebody else to tell them to do that. And you really see this throughout Israeli society. I mean, there's countless examples, from a problem that might come up in a supermarket to a problem with a bus or a car or anything. You see Israelis just jumping in the opportunity. It's almost like they love it. They love taking on a problem and seeing if they can solve it. And there's a sense of you feel good, like if you were the one who was able to do that. But this, in general, of course, nothing's 100%. But there's this really strong feeling in Israel. You don't just sit back and wait for someone else to get the job done. You go forward and you try it yourself. And that's the idea of being a Rosh Gadol.
That's an amazing quality. You also shared with me something about the Zionist thinker, Ahad Ha'am, and how he has this idea of a Merkaz Ruchani, a spiritual center that inspires Jews living anywhere in the world in a positive way. So how do you see this idea playing out in today's global Jewish reality? And what are ways to nurture this idea within ourselves?
There are a few ideas and teachings of the early Zionist thinkers, which Ahad Ha'am was. His real name was Asher Ginsburg. He was a thinker, leader, writer, teacher. And some of these early leaders, they said things which came true. Like they were very prophetic. And I feel like his idea of Israel, he didn't know it was going to be called Israel at the time. Whatever the state was going to be a Merkaz Ruchani. Not only that it would be, he thought it had to be. Unlike Herzl, Ahad Ha'am felt that even before we set up a political state, we need to revive our Jewish culture, because he felt that in the 2,000 years of the exile, the diaspora, Jewish culture took a beating. It was in a very sad and weak state, and he wanted to rebuild it in the land of Israel. And he felt that was going to be the heart and the soul of the Jewish return to the land of Israel. And he was right. And we're still seeing this unfold. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's a huge topic, right? But just briefly, I will say his idea was that in the land of Israel, the Jews that are moving here are going to rebuild themselves up spiritually, culturally. When he said a cult, a spiritual center, it wasn't so much the way that we think of spiritual today. It's more like a culture, the arts, the writing, theater, that these things will rebuild again in our Hebrew language. And this, once built, will be an inspiration for all Jews living anywhere in the world. So when they come to this state, the future state from his perspective, they'll come to this place and they'll be inspired by what they see, because it's the only place in the world where this is happening. They'll be inspired as Jews, and they'll take that inspiration with them back to their home countries and to the best of their abilities, implement it and make it part of their lives there. And that was this idea of Israel being a spiritual center for the Jewish communities and the Jewish individuals worldwide.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, that the language, right? Like, he's not just talking about, nowadays we think, Hebrew is this idea that connects us all, but he was really focused on something more than just that, and that the language doesn't just connect us through prayer or through, synagogue, but there's something wider and bigger to our connection as a people.
100%. The idea of the role of the language is huge, and it's the Jews returning to their language. It's developing the language in new ways. But maybe it's because I'm like an Oleh, like an immigrant here, even though it's been like 17 years. When I hear Hebrew, there's just something to it. There's something about Jews speaking Hebrew to one another, especially in this land. When I speak Hebrew, when I can understand Israelis when they speak Hebrew, I've come a long way, and I understand, almost all the time. But it's just this feeling like you're connecting to your people through your language, and I really feel like that was part of his vision for sure.
So you mentioned that you wrote a book, Becoming Israeli, and this is about a bunch of different families or bloggers that share their stories of how they're fitting in within Israeli society or learning to become Israeli. And not just, I think it goes beyond becoming an Israeli citizen, but becoming Israeli takes on another idea or another meaning. You shared with me that there are also other ways, right, to become Israeli without physically moving to Israel, by developing a sort of hyper-identity. So what is this hyper-identity that you were describing, or that you describe, and can you explain it to us?
100%. Definitely, like I said before, when you make Aliyah, it's not just like, I made Aliyah, now like I'm done. It's like it begins this whole new chapter of becoming Israeli. And that's a process that unfolds over years. And I think on some level is endless. But for me, after a certain amount of years, I started to realize there are things happening here that would benefit Jews living anywhere. And, the fact that we have our own state, the fact that the state of Israel exists, doesn't only impact the Jews living inside that state, it impacts the Jews living all over the country, all over the world automatically. So I really started to think about this idea, talk to other people about this idea, hear their ideas, and really start to think about this hyper identity for the Jewish people today. The fact that we have a state of Israel, right? It almost like automatically creates this hyper identity for us, no matter where we live. On some level, like we're all Israeli. I mean, that's the original name that we were called. We weren't called Jews at the beginning of our history. We're called Israelites, right? Israelites, Israelis. We're all part of this nationhood, and I think that's one of the most powerful things that the state of Israel, the existence of the state of Israel, has brought back to the Jewish people, is this sense of nationhood. We started with it, we lost it. For 2,000 years, we didn't have it. We had communities. We were amazing at building Jewish communities. We still are, right? But with Israel, we become a nation builder as well. And that, on some level, for me, has to influence Jews living everywhere. And I really feel, that Israel should invite Jews living anywhere in the world to feel like they're part of this. Again, whether or not you live there, that's your personal choice. You want to move to Israel, you don't want to move to Israel, that's your personal choice. That's a very personal choice. But feel, please, that you are part of a nation again. You're part of a nation, who returned to its land, who returned to its language, that's developing its culture in brand new ways based on the ancient ways. And I mean, you can only benefit by being part of this new kind of hyper identity of what it means to be a Jew in the world, which on the deepest level, I think, is what it means to be an Israeli in the world today.
Thank you for that. in the chat, actually, we're going to be including a couple links to some JITAP games that are meant for children in elementary school, potentially maybe middle school, to develop that connection to Israel, to develop a connection to the Hebrew language. And some of these games are tours of the land, or going on a tour of the desert. And so I encourage everybody who's watching out there to check these games out and play them with your children. And they're even fun for adults, to tell you the truth. I like playing them myself. So serving country and home is a huge cultural value in Israel. From the IDF to Sherut Lumi, which is national service, everyone has an opportunity to devote their time, energy, and talents to Israeli society. In your opinion, what are other cultural values that can help us connect to the spirit of being Israeli?
100%. It's amazing to see the sense of service be expressed in Israel. And of course, Israel's not the only country that values volunteering and service and all that. Of course, we don't have a monopoly on it, but there is something about seeing it expressed in this Jewish way, in this small little state of Israel, where almost everybody will go either to the army or national service and know that they're giving 2 to 3 years of their, of their prime years to something bigger than themselves. It's humbling. I mean, I grew up, being taught, the importance of giving and volunteering. But when you're seeing it happening on a national level, it's a whole nother thing. To watch my own kids, our oldest is almost 15, to watch him and his friends, they already know that they're going to the army. They know, so what they're preparing for isn't necessarily college. Right? When college is a great thing, I highly support it. But when you go to college, it's really about me. Like, what do I want to do in the world? Like, what profession do I want to do? And so what do I have to study to get there? When you go to the army, you're not thinking that. Yes, you want to get into the best unit possible, but why? Because you want to serve your country in the best way possible. So it's just a very powerful thing to see. But going further than that, what ways could people bring other attributes, other aspects of Israel into their own lives? I think that there's many, but to highlight just a few, and this first one is definitely connected to this idea of service, but leadership, and it ties back into this idea of Rosh Gado that we're talking about. Like, be a leader, step up, look around, like, there's this ancient Jewish teaching from Pirkei Avot, like, where there's no leader, be one, and I just feel like it's such a powerful philosophy of the modern state of Israel. So that's something that people can really take and glean and learn from Israel and bring it into their own individual lives and communities wherever they live in the world. Another one is Jewish pride. That's a whole other topic, but I'll just say really briefly, unfortunately, this is my own personal experience. I didn't grow up, unfortunately, with a lot of Jewish pride growing up in America. That doesn't mean other people didn't. I hope they did, but I didn't. And I didn't really see many people in my life who did. And for me, I felt like, Jews who were like religious, they had Jewish pride. Those who weren't, I didn't grow up religious, we weren't so proud to be Jews. Like, what was there to be proud of? And then you come to Israel, and it's just across the board, left wing, right wing, center, politically, doesn't matter. Everyone's proud. Everyone wants like the best Israel possible, and to be a Jewish state, right? And religiously, secular, religious, it's a pride I feel is oozing, out in this country from all different kinds of people. And I think that's another really important fundamental aspect of Israel, and something that people could really take with them again to wherever they live in the world. I'll give a kind of a funny example, but I remember seeing this years ago, and it's just stuck in my head, and I've seen it many times before. I was actually sitting with a group of students in Tel Aviv, and we're having conversations not too different than this one, about what it means that Israel's a Jewish state and how can it, inspire Jews around the world. And we're sitting in Tel Aviv in this big open square, and this, typical Tel Avivan, rides through on his simple little bike. He's got a tank top and, kind of cut shorts and this, long thing of hair. And he's got tattoos on his body. And one of the tattoos was of a Magen David, of a Jewish star. And I'm like, okay, I might not be into tattoos, but that's just so cool that he feels proud enough as a Jew, to stick that thing on his body for everyone to see. I just feel like that's just so Israeli on some level, and that really expresses again that inner pride, again, which I think is a powerful thing here, and could be shared with Jews living outside. And the last thing I would say is this guiding force of Tikkun Olam. Right? We know this. We talk about this. It's a big, idea that people bring up when we talk about Israel. But Israel, it has to focus a lot on security and survival, and it's amazing that we can dedicate any time or energy or efforts to Tikkun Olam, to thinking beyond ourselves. But it's unbelievable. There's this amazing quote by David Ben Gurion. I don't have it word for word, but I'll just paraphrase it. He says, now that we've established the Jewish state, it's given us this opportunity to do what we're really here to do, and that's to be light into the nations. That was David Ben Gurion who said that, in the beginning years of the state. And we know it's somewhere like deep in our genes, that we know that our return to the land of Israel, to build the state of Israel, is not just about creating a safe haven for the Jewish people, away from all the anti-Semitism we experienced over the last 2,000 years. It's something much. It's something much bigger than that. It has to be something much bigger than that, because the vision of Judaism is much bigger than that. Right? And now we're home. Now we have a country. We've returned to nationhood, our language, all these things that we're talking about. Now we can really focus on what we're really here to do, and that's Tikkun Olam. And you see that obviously expressed in so many different ways in Israel. And I think that's one of the most important things that a Jew living anywhere could be inspired by and take with them into their lives. To know that this is a Jewish value, but it's also very much an Israeli value. And it's coming, I like to think this, and I like to say this, that I really feel that Tikkun Olam has never been so strong, right, since the state of Israel was born. Right? We've never had the opportunity as Jews to bring this value to life, not just in a personal way, but in a national way. That's never been done before, at least not in the last 2,000 plus years. And that, I think, can inspire Jews living anywhere.
It's amazing to hear your passion about it, really. And we're up with our 18-minute leaders. And what I want to ask you, Akiva, is if you had to tweet one takeaway, what would it be from this discussion?
Okay, so that's a hard one, but I think I would say this. It might sound funny, but I think if you heard the previous 18 minutes, you understand what I'm talking about, because I never, tell people they have to make Aliyah. Again, that's a very personal choice. But my tweetable or my takeaway would be Israeli wherever you live in the world.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to continuing this discussion.
Thank you so much, Creator. It was a pleasure.